Hello, everyone. Welcome to Therapy Clips with Dr. O. I am from Human Service Consultants. Today, our topic will focus on trauma. Through trauma, we will create an exposure hierarchy to work through the traumatic event. I like to first say that trauma can fall into various categories. These categories include abuse, child sexual, physical abuse, domestic violence, also exposure to hurtful and painful events, dealing with being in the military or living in a neighborhood that's unsafe. Now, what I will do is I will walk through the exposure hierarchy so that you can know some activities that you can use. So, some of the activities in exposure hierarchy would include talk about my trauma, go to the location of my trauma, go somewhere that reminds me of my trauma, participate in an activity that reminds me of my trauma, hold an object that reminds me of my trauma, watch a TV show or movie that reminds me of my trauma, read a book related to my trauma, listen to music that reminds me of my trauma, write the story of my trauma, mentally review the story of my trauma, draw or paint trauma reminders, prepare food that reminds me of my trauma, play a video game that reminds me of my trauma, listen to someone talk about a similar trauma, wear something that reminds me of my trauma, look at appropriate images that remind me of my trauma. See, what happens is you want to be reminded of the trauma in controlled situations so that you can deal with these uncomfortable emotions, painful memories, and debilitating symptoms. It's natural to want to avoid these reactions once again. It's natural to want to avoid these reactions. However, over time, if you avoid these reactions, then they will exacerbate. That means that you'll think about it when you really don't want to think about it. And that means that you'll continuously think about it over time. But through exposure and creating an exposure hierarchy, then you are learning how to deal with your trauma and not avoid the situation. So once again, when you are working to deal with your trauma, you want to do it in a safe and a controlled way. So let's look at the quality of good exposure activities. There are 4 things that you want to do. You want to make sure that when you are dealing with your trauma, the activities should be safe. Although these activities will be uncomfortable for you, they should never be unsafe. You want to deal with your trauma in a controllable way. So, you should not invite other people to help you to deal with your trauma. So, in other words, you don't want to be approached by a stranger if you've been raped before, because that would trigger the trauma. and the reaction that dealt with the trauma in an unsafe way. Or watch a news show about a hurricane that's near you because it's too close to you, and it will remind you of a trauma if you've ever been in a hurricane or an earthquake. You want to be specific. You want to say, I want to walk my neighbor's dog for 30 minutes in our neighborhood, and not, I want to walk a dog. Because what dog would you walk? Where? So the better activity would be, ask your neighbor if you could walk their dog for 30 minutes in the neighborhood. And this is related to exposure to a phobia. So if you have a fear of dogs, then walking a dog that your neighbor has and who probably know you already would be safe. Or you may say, I want to walk the dog with my neighbor. So the neighbor is right there and can control his or her dog. You want to make sure that the activity is repeatable. So you want to do this activity at least 4 times. So here's a tip. Include activities with a range of distress ratings, and I'll explain that in a few minutes. You want to rate your distress from low to high, meaning what caused you the least amount of distress. That would be a low rating. And what caused you the high amount of distress would be a higher rating. So here's an example of the actual exposure hierarchy. Once again, an exposure hierarchy is a tool to rank trauma reminders that cause you distress and that you typically avoid. So when you create this exposure hierarchy, you'll create your hierarchy by ranking situations from least to most distressing on a scale of 0 to 100, where 0 is no distress at all and 100 is the most distress imaginable. So in the box, you'll see the activity. Read 3 news articles about car accidents. And the person gave this a distress rating of 25. For 30 minutes, listen to the music that was playing during my car accident. And so the distress rating was a 60. Drive on the road where I had my car accident. And so the distress rating is 100. So as you can see, this is all about a person who have a great deal of trauma related to a car accident that he or she was involved in. And so when you're in therapy with me, I will give you this form and we will begin to deal with your trauma. So thank you for your time. I really enjoyed speaking with you today. And hopefully we can begin to work through your trauma so that you can put it behind you and move forward in your life. And as always, I want to say that we have all faced some type of traumatic event, and we can move beyond it if we have the support system that we need. I want you to be blessed. I want you not to focus on your traumatic event today. I want you to do something that's going to bring happiness to you and not sadness. And with this, I want to say, love always and be blessed.